I'm an academically trained futurist. What does that mean? What that means basically is not that I predict what's going to happen, because you cannot predict. It does mean that I spend a lot of time looking at two particular things: patterns of change, how change itself changes, and the stories people tell about where change might take us, and more importantly, where they want change to take us, right? So what I've prepared today is a sort of buffet of stories about the future, images of the future, and a challenge to you to think about how to imagine your future yourself. So let me dive right in. And I want you to take a second and think back maybe to your childhood. What was the first story of the future that you remember hearing that fascinated you? And maybe it was a forecast. Someone was talking about what life was going to be like, when you were an adult. Maybe it was a book you read or a movie you saw that depicted a future. What was that first story of what the future could be like that you can remember? The interesting thing about images of the future is that we think about the future, and the shape of our thoughts about the future is rooted in our emotions and our unconscious and in our culture. And so there are the positive images of the future that reflect our hopes and reflect the fact that we've all experienced wonderful things in our lives. And there are the really dark and scary, potentially dystopian stories of the future that reflect the fact that we've experienced terrible things in our lives. We've experienced trauma or accidents or loss. And so there are the images of the future that really illustrate what we fear might happen in the future. And then there are sort of the more logical, well, tomorrow is probably going to be a lot like today, bits of extrapolation, where you assume that things will sort of keep on the same track they're on now. And then there are the really wild and crazy futures based on our letting our imagination go free. And all of those are valid ways to think about the future, to explore the future. And the other thing that you should remember is that there are how many billions of us on the planet? So all the people sitting next to you right now have in their heads already a whole lot of ideas and images about what the future could be, what the near-term future could be, what the weekend will be like, what next year would be like, what the next decade would be like. So we're surrounded every day by sort of walking, talking baskets of images of the future that are us. And also, that's been true for all the millennia of human existence. So our history is rich with images of the future. And when you think about that issue of hopes and fears, the future you hope for, the future you fear, the future you sort of extrapolate and sort of really wild futures, that's also subjective. So as you're looking at these images, ask yourself, is that a future I'm really hoping for? Is that a future that I fear? Is that a future that I think is likely? Is that a future that is a product of sort of my most creative imagination? So, those are just 4 quick images, and think about how you respond to each of those. And again, the thing we really need to remember is that there are images of the future from the past where people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago were also sitting around and wondering what the future might be like, and told stories about that or drew images of that. And there are people engaged in that right now in the present, and there will be people thinking about the future in very different ways. And those images are embedded throughout our culture. So there are ancient images of what our futures might be. This in particular, of course, is the famous surrealist Hieronymus Bosch. And this is an image of a spiritual future. What might happen, if you don't behave correctly in the present, where you might end up in the future. There are retro ideas about the future, right? Past futures, where we will be floating through the sky with robots. We will still have gender divisions in terms of housework, apparently. But they got the teleconferencing part right. In almost every ad, there are futures embedded because advertising is basically saying, buy my product and you'll have a better culinary future, a better dating future, a better business future, right? So ads are always selling you a product by selling you a possible and a better future. Every political ideology has in it, at its core, an image of the future because politicians are basically saying, vote for me and I will deliver to you a better future for our community, for our city, for our region, for our nation. And so the question you should always ask yourself is, what is that image of the future, right, that a politician is promising you when they ask you for your vote? We build images of the future into our infrastructure, and different architectural schools say different things about our values, about how we live together, about what's important with regard to the relationship between people and technology or people and nature. And those values shift over time so that designs for buildings now are much more embedded with nature. They don't separate humanity from the wilderness and the wildness of natural ecosystems, right? They bring them into the buildings very often. Transports, how we get around, has embedded in it ideas of what the future could be like, right? Are we all still going to be buying cars in the future? Are we all going to be riding in trains instead of planes? Will we be perhaps using blimps, slower but greener? Gardens can tell us something about values and imply certain kinds of futures. Are we rebuilding ecosystems? Are we establishing entirely new and artificial ecosystems? Are we perhaps embedding gardens that provide food for us on every single rooftop in an urban environment so that we bring food production in closer to where the denser population is in our society? There have been entire buildings designed as cities and communities of tomorrow, and in particular, Paulo Soleri, the late architect, was famous for this in building his arcologies, single buildings that would hold hundreds of thousands of people as a way to build spiritual community, interestingly. So buildings, architecture, infrastructure can imply a lot about the kind of future that we might see. And all of these images of the future, again, are all around you. We are awash in stories about the future and images of what the future could be. And again, as you look through these, which of them do you find attractive and why? Which of them do you think could never happen or are controversial and why? And of course, there are literally stories of the future. And we have seen more and more in my work, in my community of futures research and foresight, more and more collaboration with science fiction and speculative fiction writers to write exploratory narrative stories, science fiction stories about what the future could be, what the conflicts we might face in the future are, what the challenges in terms of humanity finding a resilient way to live within the limits of planetary systems, stories about how people will relate to the technology they're building and the potential for artificial intelligence, how people will manage a new ability to edit our own genome, to edit the very living organism that is ourselves, right? So people are exploring in a lot of different ways. And of course, now with advanced technology in computer graphics, not only do we have stories that explore different possible futures, we more and more have amazing and astonishing, visually astonishing movies that are immersive in their ability to portray the fine day-to-day details of different kinds of futures. And you'll note that these are not all utopian futures. They're not all positive. Some of these futures feature dysfunctional political and governance structures. Some of them feature environmental collapse. Some of them feature poverty. Some of them feature pollution. Some of them are ordinary life, facing all the usual challenges of ordinary life with some technological innovation or some environmental shift written over them as a context. So when you go see a blockbuster movie that's about the future, one of the things that you can start doing to sort of stretch your imagination and to practice thinking about the future and practice writing your own stories, envisioning your own images of the future, is to ask yourself what it would be like to spend a day in the future that the movie projects. What would it be like to live there, to work there? What if you were a tourist visiting this city? How would you get around? What would be the interesting sights that you'd want to see or the experiences you'd want to have? How are different cultures emerging and mixing and being written into the future and being, how are geopolitical shifts represented in the future and shifting global centers of power? How do those emerge, not just in the infrastructure or the products or the advertisements, but even in the language and the slang? Slang changes as everything else changes. And all you have to do is hang out with people 10 years younger than you, or 40 years younger than you, or 50 years younger than you, in my case, to see that, to hear that the doorways into the future are bubbling up as new interests, new fads among the young, new technologies, new ways of talking about the world. And of course, there are images of the future that mix it up, that present in a very even-handed way the fact that there will be some downsides, some negative details about the future, and some upsides, some things that we like. Because let's face it, that's reality. If we look around at the present, there are some things that are awe-inspiring and unbelievably beautiful. And there are things that are, by the same token, terrible beyond belief, and tragic, horrifically tragic in our world. That's reality. And so any realistic story about the future, any realistic image of the future, should contain both positives and negatives, because that's how the world works. And the other thing that you should think about is that no one change will create whatever future each of us ends up in. The future is going to be an emergent property of many different changes and their impacts all interconnected and colliding. And again, because that's exactly what produced the present that we live in. Right now, if you think about the present that we are in, we're seeing the combination of years of industrial manufacturing and global capitalism combined with extensive digital innovation in terms of both computers and communication, overlaid with new capabilities, emerging capabilities in synthetic biology, in genetic manipulation, in being able to sort of print locally products on demand because of 3D printing. So we're at an interesting point where a lot of changes are bubbling up. And there are also value shifts occurring because all of those years of material exploitation for the purposes of manufacturing goods and services and distributing them globally have meant that we are running up against planetary system limits. And that is now becoming very obvious. And the younger generation is bringing it to our attention that they don't feel that we, the adults in the room, have done a very good job addressing the impacts of those contradictions and the impacts of pressing up against planetary system limits. So it's entirely possible that there will be a major value shift in terms of culture and politics over the next 10 years as that outrage gets expressed in new ways of thinking, new paradigms, new models of the economy, new models of providing and caring for each other and caring for the planet and other natural systems. So there's a lot that is potentially emerging. And the main thing that I want to underline about being a futurist, to go back to that, is that there are no future facts. So quite frankly, in one regard, I'm no more an expert on the future than any of you are. It's not as if I can transport myself into the future and observe it and collect data the way a scientist normally would. Can't do that. The only facts I can collect are facts about trends of change, patterns of change in the past, current data about emerging changes, and the data about the images of the future that all of you hold in your minds. Because one of the core assumptions of future studies is that our actions, to some extent, are based on our images of the future and what we project the future to be. So that image of the future is really important. What do most people think the future holds? How can we possibly help create change, create a better world by shifting that image of the future that everyone thinks is possible and having a conversation about a future that we all think is desirable, that can maybe align our actions and align what we work towards? We need more of those kinds of images. And so what I invite all of you to do is think about what sort of future it is that you want and what that looks like at a really detailed level. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, what would your daily life be like? What would your work be like in a future that was better than the present on whatever dimensions you care to measure being better, right? Now, I said that I basically study two things, one of which is images of the future. The other is change, patterns of change, emerging changes, because emerging changes have impacts. And some of those impacts will not be great, and we want to be prepared for them. But some of the impacts of change open up opportunities that we can perhaps leverage to get us to our better future faster, right? So what kind of future would you build given that? And sort of what story can you tell, remembering that the key idea behind narrative and drama is that there is an inciting incident or something that's a challenge. And there's rising action where the hero is, taking up new tools and new skills and new understandings and new insight and transforming the situation in bringing action to a climax, and then in falling action, setting that change into place, stabilizing it, and resolving the action and resolving the transformative change into a new, stable future. So that's our dramatic arc. What are some of the dramatic tensions that I think about when I'm building stories of the future that you should think about in imagining what the future could be based on the changes you see around you? So in terms of those changes, the kind of dramatic tensions you should be paying attention to is if this change plays out, so if we get machine learning gets so sophisticated, it is artificial general intelligence, and we start putting it to use, who wins? Who reaps the benefits of that? Who's going to lose when that gets implemented or pay the costs? Who gets marginalized? Great question. How are criminals going to put it to use? Organized crime always finds a way to put innovations to use. How do artists use it as a medium? How are kids going to engage with artificial general intelligence and make it a game or a toy? How will we transform it into a vice of some sort, into porn? And how will the government regulate it? So those are dynamics and details of the story that you could tell about some change that interests you. What are some of those changes? Well, we're seeing massive shifts in the collection of data about ourselves. I'm wearing an Apple Watch, and it tells me what my heart rate is and what my breathing rate is and what my heart rhythm is and how much I've walked and whether I'm standing, which I'm standing right now at a standing desk because, it keeps reminding me I should stand up more. So digital health is going to become a big part of the future. Digital health data, feeding into public health data. What kind of future would that create? How would that change things? How would that change daily life? Smart cities commonly talked about, how we are embedding all of these sensors and microprocessors in our cities and in order to have a very fine-grained understanding of what's going on where, maybe be able to fix things faster. On the other hand, maybe be able to surveil our citizens more extensively, upsides, downsides. We're able to manipulate genetics in ways that have proven very helpful in the current pandemic with regard to developing mRNA vaccines quite quickly. And we can also do completely frivolous things like installing the genes for a firefly into a bunny and enabling it to glow in the dark, which tells you again that if a technology makes something possible, people will explore its use in different and weird ways. We can 3D print things. People are 3D printing houses. They are 3D printing park infrastructures. They are 3D printing small technologies. They are 3D printing organs with living cells. What kind of future would that lead to? Power generation has gotten smaller and smaller and more efficient, and we're embedding photovoltaic cells in everything. So we could have micropower everywhere. And these days you can recharge things with inductive recharging, so you don't actually have to plug things in. So what if we lined our roads with solar photovoltaic cells, gave our electric cars induction rechargers, and they could simply be constantly recharging themselves as they drove down the road? And then, of course, we wouldn't actually have to be driving those cars because the artificial intelligence would simply be piloting them for us. We could turn them into meeting rooms or cinemas or libraries, bedrooms. And our ability to create innovations on the boundaries between manipulating DNA and manipulating very, very small micro machines or nanomachines is going to converge and create amazing new capabilities again. And what are some of the ways those capabilities could be used? We think of it in terms first maybe of health, but you could also think of it in terms of warfare. what are the stories you would tell? What does the future look like that would include DNA-tailored nanopharmaceuticals? And then, of course, there is the giant scenic backdrop to every other emerging signal of change, which is the global climate crisis. And the fact that we're seeing heat stress and flooding and wildfires and shifts in the environment and loss of Arctic ice much sooner than the models that scientists were producing 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. 40 years ago, I was working on projects looking at the effect of climate change and global sea level rise on Pacific Island nations. 40 years ago. This has been discussed for a long time, and we haven't done anything about it yet. It's kind of amazing. So what kind of situations might that create in the future? And at what point will, the heroes in our dramatic arc finally overcome the resistance to change to address this global crisis? We are all on a hero's journey. We just don't always know it. So this is my bid to ask you to explicitly understand that you are on a hero's journey into the future. And that if you keep your eye on emerging changes, if you heighten your awareness of change and your ability to think through the dramatic tensions and the conflicts and the upsides and downsides that change can create, that you have a better chance of being the hero, of creating change, of helping other people create change in your organizations, in your community, in your nation. That you need to arm yourself with an understanding of change. And I just want to end with this wonderful quote. Ursula Le Guin, famous science fiction writer, was challenged to defend why science fiction was something anyone would even want to do. And I have faced often the same challenge with regard to future studies. And what she's written here applies equally well to future studies. If science fiction has a major gift to offer literature, I think it is just this: the capacity to face an open universe, physically open, cyclically open, no doors shut. That is what future studies tries to do. Open you up, open your thinking up to the possibilities of the future and to the images of the future, a better future that you can imagine, that you can build with the bricks of the changes you notice around you and the conversations and the alignment of other people around you who also want to build a better future. Science fiction and future studies seems to be the modern literary art which is capable of living in the large house of humanity that she describes as not a comfortable, reassuring place, a large and drafty house, but it's the house we live in. And our ability to explore using either futures thinking or science fiction enables us to live in that huge and drafty house and feel at home there and play games up and down stairs from the basement to the attic and fully inhabit all our pasts, all our presents, and all our futures. So I return to you the gift of your imagination about what a better future might be and hope that you may live in interesting times.
Perhaps we can take one or two questions.
The question was if you believe in a better future.
Good question. Okay, I heard that. Do I believe in a better future? Do I believe a better future is possible, given the momentum of some of the negative changes we face? And the answer is yes, I do. There are all over the world sort of small points of light, people working on amazing projects locally and internationally and regionally to create new models and new paradigms for living within the systems of the planet. Are they happening as fast as we would like? Are the shifts happening as fast as we would like? Not always, but it's sort of a race. And at some point, what a lot of people who have been studying the issue for a long time essentially say is, we just all have to keep on adapting and working to adapt. At this point, we can't stop climate change, but we can get prepared to live within it, to reduce the impacts as much as possible, to mitigate some of the worst impacts, and to adapt to the new future we're going to live in. And humans are insanely adaptable. We are very creative. And so do I think it is possible to survive this crisis? I mean, as a civilization, human civilization, yes, I do. I don't think my grandnieces and great-grandchildren will live in a world that is much like the world we're living in right now. And I think they will have very different assumptions. But I still believe that it is entirely possible for the next generations to have happy and contented lives. They just won't be, their lifestyles just won't be like ours. I guess I'm moderately optimistic, maybe, or guardedly optimistic.
Thank you so much, Wendy.
Thank you. I would like to make one last point. What I spend most of my time doing, as Narina herself knows, is designing and running workshops to help people build futures and to help people explore change. And that's what I really love doing. And so if any of you are interested in doing that, let me know. Always happy to run a workshop. So everyone, take care. Have a wonderful evening. Have a good weekend when you get to it, and stay safe.